So, welcome to question 78 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for today is the sin of usury, and I am Dr. Thibault. When we look at the sin of usury, it's under a very short section, um, and that is voluntary commutations, which falls under the topic of justice. We're under the virtue of justice, and we're dealing with commutations and particularly uh, voluntary commutations, which um, are relationships with our neighbor, which are voluntary. We covered some in the last section that dealt with backbiting or reviling or derision. These are things that are done to a person. Uh, they are voluntary on the part of the reviler, but the person being reviled is not voluntary. In this situation, these two, cheating, which if you haven't seen, just look to the last question. Um, he's talking about economic cheating. It takes two people, and usury as well takes two people. So they're talking about things which are voluntary in terms of both people being involved in it in one way or another, although one person is always hurt by the situation more than the other. That's why it is both mutually benefited. It might probably wouldn't be a vice, it would be a virtue. So we are covering usury. Now it brings us to the first and the most important question in question 78, which is can you take money, can you take usury for money lent? You charge interest on a loan. Uh, and St. Thomas says, he who commits an injustice who lends wine or wheat and asks for double repayment. That's at the heart of this. Make it any clearer. To take usury for money lent is unjust in itself. So the answer is right off the bat from the very beginning. No, you cannot take interest on a loan. As you can see, that like with cheating, this goes to kind of attacks the heart of the American capitalist system in some regards. If you can recall from cheating, he says you can't, you shouldn't charge as much as you can. If you buy something and you go to resell it, you can only charge a very low amount, a very reasonable amount. You can't charge what the market will bear. You just have to charge what is fair, and it's hard to kind of figure out what is fair because under our American capitalist system, what is fair is what the market can bear. But that's not what it is for St. Thomas. This is a similar situation where you can't lend money for interest. Well, it kind of gets at the heart of what our economy is based on. It says if you return something, if you require or somebody to pay a usury, then the person pays in equal measure for what is borrowed. So a person borrows 100 pounds of wheat, they should pay back 100 pounds of wheat. That would be what is equal, which is kind of at the heart of justice, is paying back what is equally owed. But a user also requires you to pay the price of the use, which is called usury. So, if you want to get a payday loan, you might be paying borrowing $100, and next week you have to pay back $130. Well, $100 would be what's equal. The $30 is the usury part of it. It's the price of use, usury. So that part would be unethical, according to St. Thomas. Now, some definitions might make this easier for somebody who's using this video to help learn the Summa. Money, for example, and he brings this definition up from Aristotle in cheating as well in question 77. It says money was invented chiefly for the purpose of exchange. It exists for consumption and alienation. So instead of lifting into your wagon 500 pounds of wheat in order to change it for 500 pounds of grapes, you could convert it to gold, and then with just a small handful of gold, you could make an exchange. So it would be cheap. It's just out of convenience, so that you can uh, use it, right? It's a utilitarian function in some way, and it's alienated. It can be transferred, right? It's something that you could trade. It's easier to trade gold than it is to trade wine or grapes or wheat. Um, so that's at the heart of what money is about. It's used for trade. It's not meant for hoarding. Right? That's its consumption and alienation is made to be used, and it's made to be exchanged, but it's not made to be hoarded. This definition. Um, Venerate is another term which comes up very close to the Latin, which means to lend with interest. Now, venerate then is part of usury, so that would be unethical, venerate. Uh, then there's usufruct, which is the right to use something without diminishing it. So if um, I rent to you my house, I expect the house back in the condition in which you received it, right? That's kind of the nature of it. So the house hasn't been diminished in any way. I gave to you one house, I've been returned one house. Um, I let you use my tractor, I get back one tractor. In the same condition in that I gave it to you. That would be usufruct. Um, so that is perfectly ethical. According to St. Thomas. That's how it should be, right? If you lend something, you should get it back as you gave it. Um, this issue often comes up with why usury is so bad in terms of brotherhood, is the idea. We're still on Article 1 here. St. Thomas says Jews were forbidden to take usury from their brethren, meaning other Jews, but uh, uh, they could take interest on loans to other nations. So the question of who is your brother from St. Thomas's view in the Jewish sense would be other Jews. But he says as Christians, we cannot take usury from any person because we have to treat every person as our neighbor and brother. So if we treat our neighbor as ourselves, and who is our neighbor? Everyone. So because of that, we as Christians are unable to take interest on a loan from anyone. He says it really is a breakdown of society. If you think about who you would lend to, if you were to lend $100 to your mother, would you charge your mother interest on a loan? If your brother were to ask you for $500, would you charge your brother interest? St. Thomas uh, says, well, no, clearly you wouldn't do this to your closest friends and your closest families. Nowadays, people probably would, but St. Thomas, of course you wouldn't do something like that. Um, so if you wouldn't do it to your neighbor, you wouldn't do it to your friends, you wouldn't do it to the people who are closest to you. Well, the Christian vocation is to treat everyone like that, not just your closest friends. In Islam, this is also a very strong component of Islam, the riba, which is not getting any type of benefit from someone out of lending. There can't be any profit from it. The Muslim nations have set up entire systems of no interest banking because they believe that if you were to uh, go into debt, if you were to pay interest on a loan, you're essentially enslaving someone, and you can't enslave people. So the Muslims are much stronger with saying we're going to enforce this. Whereas if you consider most Western Christian nations, almost all of them have banks, and they all charge interest. If you were to consider even Catholic um, uh, uh, credit unions, if you were to get a mortgage from the bank, you would be paying a lower rate of interest probably than Bank of America or one of these big companies, but you would still be paying interest. Whereas in the Muslim nations, they wouldn't, Muslim religion, they wouldn't be able to take any interest on that loan. Um, they take it much more seriously than Christians do, unfortunately. It is also maybe one of the reasons why Christians forced Jewish people throughout history into banking, because it was forbidden for Christians to take usury, but the borrowing of money is very useful, especially for princes and kings who are trying to raise armies. The most powerful people, the ones that actually have to borrow the most money, and they want a way of doing that. Otherwise, they might lose their war, lose their project, whatever they're working on. So, you find a convenient way of having the Jewish people do it, and the Jewish people would be okay with doing it so long as they weren't lending to other Jews, which they weren't. They were lending to the Christians. Um, so by doing this, Christians had made Jewish people bankers and um, people like the Rothschilds very rich, and then they scapegoat them for being bankers. Well, we turn them into that because of these usury laws. Now, one of the objections, and I think this is really a very interesting objection, objection 6 here in Article 1. I think it's a very good point. Usually you want to always agree with St. Thomas's response, not the objection, but some objections are really good points, and I think objection 6 is one of them. And the point of the objection is, if you can have a silver chalice, you could lend it to somebody, and you could receive um, profit from lending it. In that regard, it's kind of like a loan. I mean, like renting it to some degree, right? You're giving it to somebody, and they're paying you back for it plus interest, or we would call that rent. They would be renting it in some sense. So, but you could rent a silver chalice, a silver cup. Um, but he said, but if you were to melt it down into coins and lend it to someone, the same silver, right? The same silver, lend it to somebody else, you couldn't receive a profit from it. So why can you profit from the silver chalice, but you can't profit from the silver coins when it's the exact same silver? Um, well, his point behind it is kind of an interesting one, and it ties to that question 77 of how can you make a profit from selling something as a tradesman? And it's that you have to have it you have to have increased its value in some way. You have to have bettered it in some way. So by having a chalice, the chalice isn't just raw silver. There's been artistry put into it. There's been craftsmanship that's been put into it. It is a one of a kind piece. Nothing is exactly like that. It's a piece of craftsmanship. Because it's a piece of craftsmanship, it's not completely fungible. It's not exchangeable with everything else. Whereas a silver coin is exchangeable with every other silver coin. Um, so you are consuming the coin, whereas you're not consuming the chalice. The chalice isn't being consumed. Um, so in that regard, it's not changing at all. If we go back to our earlier definitions, that chalice would be usufruct, right? It would be the right to use something without diminishing it. If you were to use that chalice, the chalice isn't being diminished. If you give somebody coins, the whole idea is that they would be spending it on something. So in that regard, if it can be spent, if it can be used, and you have an added value to it, which money you haven't added value to money. Money is still worth the money that it was. Then you can't make money off of it. Another example is you can rent a house for money, right? You can lend a house and make money house. So objects of value that have craftsmanship that you lend, you can um, make profit off of it. You just can't make profit off of things that are consumable. Uh, this is a distinction which we just don't make within our current system. So this might be kind of a foreign concept. What's what is the obvious problem with this, the challenge that we have to this, which if you spend any time with it, you get frustrated with it a little bit. And I think with question 77, you can get that way too. Is it says you're not bound to lend to people, but if you do lend, then you can't accept interest. Well, if you can't, um, if you can't, why would you lend? What would be the reason of lending if you're only going to get exactly back what you started with? Wouldn't you rather, if it's $1,000, wouldn't you rather just keep the $1,000 in your own bank account, in your own safe, so that it's there for you if you ever decide that you want it? If there's absolutely no benefit for you to lend it, and there's a risk that if you do lend it, what if they don't return it? You throw them in jail. How does that benefit you? Right? Um, uh, but so that's a tough one. Why would anyone lend? Now, Scripture points to this idea of when you lend, don't expect anything in return. It's particularly from the Gospel of Luke. You know, Give and expect nothing back. Give to everyone who asks you, and whoever takes away what is yours, do not demand it back. So essentially, lending according to the gospel, according to Jesus, is a gift. It's just gifting, giving away, right? If you have more than you need, and asks you for money, you just give it. And if they give it back, that's fine, but you don't demand it back. You don't bring them to court for it to be back. You don't hold them to an oath that they return it. It's essentially that all loans are gifts. Um, this becomes a very difficult situation in terms of real commerce, though. How do you ever get enough money to buy a house if you can't take a mortgage? Who's ever going to give you the money? Uh, uh, get a mortgage, if you're talking $300,000, who's going to give you $300,000 to buy a house with the idea that maybe you won't pay it back? And if we were to follow the gospel, uh, you don't even have to pay it back. It's going to be a kind of a short list of lenders in that regard. I think that's a tough one. Um, St. Thomas says in Article 2, I think that if you were to, I spelled that wrong. It should be a thing. I think a thing is reckoned as money if it has value. It can be measured by money. So that's frequently comes up in the Summa. Anything that can be exchanged for money is essentially money. Nothing must be paid back other than the feeling of benevolence. You have to, you can't demand any other gift. You can't say, well, you said I can't take interest on a loan. I can't ask for more money, but maybe I can get more things, right? So, like, what if I lend you uh, wheat, 100 pounds of wheat, and you return back to me 130 pounds of wheat? See, we're not talking about money. We're talking about wheat. Said, well, if it can be exchanged for money, then it's money, and nothing should be paid back extra except for feelings of benevolence. Um, Very tough in terms of economics, the practicality of it. Um, so it says, what is due to the lender? The return of the object is due, but not the profits, since they are results of human industry and not the thing itself. So if you do lend to somebody, let's say you lend somebody um, a piece of land, and they use that land to farm. Well, after the year, if you lent it for a year, you get your property back. Well, do that you deserve some of the crops from that field? He says no, because most of the crops are going to grow naturally already, which most crops don't. You have to plant them, you have to take care of them, you got to weed them, you got to harvest them, you have to put human industry into it. You don't deserve any of the results of human industry. Uh, if the thing, let's say, had already an orchard on it, well, then you have a right to the fruit from the orchard because that is natural in itself, but anything that was produced on the land by the person who borrowed the land is owed that. Uh, Again, that seems to be contrary to the way we think of things now, where you tend to think, okay, I'll let you use the land, but I want 50%, I want 40%, I want 30% of the profits of what you grew on the land. If I'm giving you the land for free, I want something from the land. St. Thomas says no, you can't ask for anything like that. Um, if the uh, if the usurer extorts profits, they should be returned. So if the person does ask for interest on a loan, they should return the interest. If they were going to do that, they probably wouldn't have asked for interest on the loan to begin with, but says they should return the interest. Um, if you one should compensate the lender for any losses he has for lending it. Now, this one line, I think, is the thing that is a key, right? If you're discussing this topic in class and everyone's saying, I don't see how this is feasible, I don't see how this is possible, well, then this is your line. This is your line here. One should, and this is, oh, I don't have it's Article 3, must be Article 3. Um, this is the key to it, and it's in the I answer section. Um, and it's that one should compensate the lender for any losses that he has for lending it. Well, now this is key because if I were to normally say how they described it, I should lend out my land and I should get nothing in return for lending out my land. Well, why on earth would I do that? I could hire laborers to till my soil and plant the seed and do all the harvest. I could hire somebody to do that for $2,000, and I can make $10,000 in profit. Uh, so if I would make $10,000 in profit, why should I lend it to you for free? I could hire somebody, even if I only make $1,000 profit. Any profit's better than nothing. Why would I give? Why would I not take any benefit whatsoever? Um, what would be the point? Well, what uh, what this one says is one should compensate the lender for any losses he has for lending it. So let's say you were to make, after you hired people to work the land, you made $10,000 profit. Well, if you were to lend out that land to somebody, you could build into that. Okay, I would have made 10,000. So you can take the land, but you got to pay me the 10,000 I would have made if I would have done it myself, if I would have hired somebody to do it myself. Um, you know, Subtract the cost of the person you were going to hire. You're going to pay somebody 2,000. Um, you made 10,000, so total was $12,000 of income, but 2,000 you had to pay, so you made 10,000 profit. Right? If you were to lend it to somebody, they might make the 12,000, right? And they have to pay you 10,000 because you would have made 10,000. That would compensate for losses. That makes sense because it doesn't require somebody a loss. Now as soon as you open up this, it opens up a whole new um, set of circumstances. So if I were to say, well, how about my $300,000 in the bank? Do I lend it to Joe so he can buy a house? Well, if I lend it to Joe to buy a house, I'm not going to see that money back for 30 years. By that time, I'll be ready to be retired and dead. Right? If I wait 30 years in order until I see that money again, and I may never see it again, and I get, I lend 300,000, I get 300,000 back. Well, if I were to put it into a mutual fund that made 8% a year or something like that, 4% a year, well, now if I were to lend it to Joe to buy his house, I would actually be taking a loss because I'd be losing 4% every year that I would have made in the mutual fund. So, I can't, probably the reasonableness factor has to tie in here. I can't say, well, I could have made 25% interest. Well, where? Where could you have made 25% interest? You probably could not have made 25% interest. Um, but could you have made 4%? Yeah, probably. So uh, if you said to Joe, I will give you the 300,000, but I want my return of lost opportunity costs, right? Opportunity losses, the mutual funds. You could even probably, if you wanted to be really accurate, after as it's going on, you could calculate what the actual that I would have invested in XYZ mutual fund. At the end of 30 years, you could say, well, how much would I have made after 30 years in XYZ mutual fund? And that should be the cost of the increase in profit that they would pay you. Now, some people might think that that's contrary to the spirit of the law, but I don't know. I don't. I think without that clause in there, this becomes a very improbable system, which is why you have ethic, nonprofit um, uh, banking, which charges low but still within reason, market interest rates, right? Yeah, because you have to do something. Um, Payday lending and something else is something like 600% interest. Well, 600% interest is clearly, we even now call that usury. We've also considered now the definition of usury within the Christian circles has kind of been modified a bit to say usury is lending at excessive interest rates. So not just, if you look at St. Thomas, he almost picks there should be no interest rates, but our current system says not excessive interest rates, like payday lending or credit cards at 30%, 20 to 30% interest. Uh, that would be clearly usury in that regard. And he says, St. Thomas says, one may borrow money under the condition of usury. So this is the interesting one that you can't take interest on a loan, but you could pay interest on a loan. I think the Muslim community they have a prohibition against both, but they focus more on you cannot pay interest on a loan, which is kind of a convenient thing. Um, Paying usury, yeah, he accepts a loan under the condition of usury does not sin. So if you borrow money under usury, you're not sinning. You're the one that's the victim in this situation. You've been victimized by these bankers, in some sense. So, uh, but then the question is, well, aren't you by paying usury fees, aren't you then creating, well, one, creating a market, and number two, the person who lent you the money has now committed a mortal sin, perhaps. You have just damned a soul to hell by borrowing that money, like a person who buys drugs from a drug dealer, right? If you didn't buy the drugs, then there would be no drug dealer, right? You can say, well, if I didn't buy the drugs, somebody else would buy the drugs. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure that's a very solid argument. Because if you give them your money, you're feeding the beast. So the St. Thomas brings that up as a problem. And St. Thomas responds to that in objection 2. He says, it is by no means lawful to induce a man to sin, yet it is lawful to make use of another sin for a good end. And he even says, well, God uses sin for a good end, so we can use sin for a good end. I wasn't entirely convinced by that line. um, it seems like you could justify many things from that response. Um, but I think he goes on and he does a little bit better with it. Is it said having a good end in view for himself, for his own good, and for the needs of others, maybe justifies it. Like you have no choice, so you have to do this. Well, okay, but then that would be one reason why you would want to have a good Catholic bank that has low interest rates, so that people who do have it, right, just like buying a house, it's like, well, I know nobody wants to pay interest when they're buying a house. However, if you really need a house, you have to live somewhere, and rents aren't cheap. So, if I have to buy a house and I have to borrow money to buy a house and I have to pay interest to buy a house, I'd rather pay a low interest rate than a high interest rate. And if a good Christian person could help me with a lower interest rate, that would be better than a pagan charging me high interest rates. So. But if this law is absolute, then it kind of prohibits the good Christian person from offering those low interest rates, because by employing interest rates, they're committing a mortal sin and therefore they are cut off. Well, we ended up shooting ourselves in the foot with that one. Um, and this last part, I think, is the more convincing argument. He who borrows from a uh, usurer creates the occasion for lending, not the occasion for usury. Uh, Still not 100% convinced by it, but I think it is still a better one, saying, if you're in a desperate situation where you need to borrow money in order to pay for whatever it is, saying a need, right? The need, maybe you have a medical bill or you have something that's desperate that you need the money. Um, by asking somebody, can you lend me the money? You are creating the opportunity for lending, um, for them to charge you more than you've asked to borrow. That's on them. That's not on you. You've just asked to borrow the money, not you didn't ask to pay the interest. So back on them. So in conclusion, this is a complicated one, which is wonderful for debate and dialogue. And I think one of the better parts of the debate is this realistic, or is this, if it were actually put into effect, would it be detrimental to society? Would it actually hurt the poor more? Because it's a law that's intended to liberate the poor, but instead would it hurt the poor more? Um, and then maybe it would ask us to consider our entire system, right? Our system is based off of it's capitalism. Our capitalist system is not mercantile capitalism anymore, but instead it's something like finance capital, where money is making money off of money uh, without it ever producing anything tangible or useful to society. I think if we were to look at that, that is at the heart of what the usury laws are about, saying that is unethical. Um, this idea of hedge funds and things like that. I think that would be what St. Thomas is really getting at, this idea that money for the sake of money, money that makes money without doing anything good. He's against that. You have to do something that adds value. You have to do something. You should be paid for your labor, not paid because money makes money. He would be against, I think, very much that form of capitalism. So to re-summarize these four, four articles, the first, usury, the civilly legal is ethically unlawful, not allowed. Um, one cannot receive anything extra for lending other than feeling good, the goodwill of others, or the spiritual benefits, as I pointed out in Scripture, where if you lend and you expect nothing back, the Lord blesses you. You don't need anything more. And then number three, if the extortion leads to profits, they must be returned. The borrower doesn't owe more than the return, other than the losses, the potential losses of the lender. And one may not lend with usury, but one can borrow under the conditions of usury if there's no other options and it's a matter of necessity. And that's all we have for here. Next we enter a new section of justice, parts of justice.